Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Okay, so we've got all this Cold War research, right? And it can feel like, I don't know, like those history mystery thrillers, Trying to figure out who to trust, what actually happened.
It's true. The Cold War, it still has this grip on us, all these years later.
Totally. So get ready for some serious aha moments because we're diving deep into 4 different ways historians have looked at the Cold War and who was really responsible for the whole thing.
Yeah, and what's fascinating is how much these different views were shaped by what was going on in the world outside the history books, It just goes to show you, history, it's not just about the facts, it's about how we interpret them.
Yeah, you got that right. I mean, it's not like we can just hop in a time machine and ask Stalin a few questions directly.
Right.
But speaking of Stalin, maybe we should start with the view that puts the Soviet Union right in the hot seat.
The Orthodox historians.
Exactly. This was the dominant way of looking at the Cold War for decades, right?
Wow. Absolutely. And, it makes sense, right? Think about it. 1950s, 1960s, Cold War's in full swing. People are living under this, constant threat of nuclear annihilation.
Yeah.
It was pretty easy to see the Soviets as the bad guys.
Yeah, like they were trying to take over the world or something. And there were a lot of historians back then who really believed that, Soviet ideology, it was all about expansion.
Yeah.
Like Arthur Schlesinger Jr., he was a big deal back then, wrote some pretty intense stuff about it.
Oh, he did. Yeah.
Yeah.
One of his most famous quotes kind of sums up the whole Orthodox view. He said, Marxism-Leninism gave the Russian leaders a view of the world according to which all societies were inexorably destined to proceed along appointed roads by appointed stages until they achieved the classless nirvana. Moreover, given the resistance of the capitalists to this development, the existence of any non-communist state was by definition a threat to the Soviet Union.
Whoa. Okay, so basically what he's saying is the Soviets, they thought their system, it was destined to win out.
Yeah, pretty much.
And anything that stood in its way, any non-communist state, a threat.
A threat, by definition. Wow. That really paints a picture of, this inevitable clash,
Yeah, definitely.
And nothing says Soviet threat like the Berlin Blockade in 1948, right? Talk about a power move.
Yeah.
It literally tried to starve West Berlin into submission.
Yeah, it was a bold move, shocking even. Stalin trying to strong-arm the West into backing down.
And then the West pulls off the Berlin airlift.
Right.
For almost a year. They're airlifting supplies into West Berlin day and night, rain or shine.
Day and night. Can you imagine?
It's like something out of a movie. Talk about a historical mic drop, right?
Seriously, such a powerful image. It really solidified this idea of East versus West, good versus evil, that really defined the Cold War for I don't know how many people.
Yeah. Okay, so we've got the Soviets as the bad guys, trying to spread their communist ideology, or at least that's how it looked to those Orthodox historians. But as always with history, there's another side to the story.
And in the 1960s, a new generation of historians came along, and they were ready to challenge that dominant narrative, right?
Revisionists.
The revisionists, exactly. And it makes sense, right? The 60s were, well, interesting times, to say the least. Vietnam War, protests, people were starting to question, well, everything.
Absolutely, and that included the whole official line on the Cold War.
So, all of a sudden, it's not so clear-cut who the good guys and bad guys are anymore.
Right.
And the revisionists, they really tapped into that skepticism. They started asking, was containing communism really all there was to it? Or was something else driving U.S. actions during the Cold War?
Yeah, what were the real motivations here?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And some of these historians, they argued that economics, it played a much bigger role than anyone wanted to admit.
Yeah, folks like Joyce and Gabriel Kolokoko, they were really influential in shaping this view.
And what'd they say?
Well, they said, look, U.S. foreign policy, it wasn't just about fighting communism.
Yeah.
It was also about, securing those markets for American businesses, expanding capitalism, making sure that the U.S. came out on top, economically, that is.
So everything the U.S. did, it was all about power. Even stuff that seemed, I don't know, humanitarian, like the Marshall Plan.
It's exactly what the revisionists would argue.
Really?
Yeah, on the surface, the Marshall Plan, it looked like the U.S. generously helping rebuild Europe after World War II. But these historians, they saw something much more strategic going on.
Okay, so what? It was all a big power play then?
Well, Joyce and Gabriel Kolko, they wrote this, and I'm paraphrasing here, but they basically said that after 1945, the U.S., their goal was to restructure the world.
Restructure the world.
Yeah, to restructure the world in a way that American businesses could trade, operate, and profit without any restrictions, anywhere. They said this required, and I quote, conservative and ultimately subservient political control throughout the globe.
So they're saying the Marshall Plan, it wasn't about rebuilding, it was about making Western Europe dependent on the U.S.?
Depended on American goods, American influence, exactly, making sure those markets were open and friendly to U.S. interests.
That's a very different way of looking at it.
Right.
Instead of, this big altruistic act to save the world from communism, it becomes...
A power grab.
Yeah, a power grab. Opportunistic, even.
It makes you think, right? Like, about the motivations behind these big, generous acts, even today.
It really does. Okay, so we've gone from the Soviets being the bad guys to the U.S. being the bad guys. But hold on, everybody, because it doesn't end there. We've got two more perspectives on the Cold War to unpack, and trust me, things are about to get even more interesting. Okay, so far it sounds like we're either blaming the Soviets or blaming the U.S. for the Cold War, but I have a feeling it's not that simple.
You're right on the money with that one. History is, well, it's messy. It's never as simple as we want it to be.
That's for sure.
And the good news is, historians, we're always learning, always revising our understanding of the past, right?
Right.
And in the 1970s, a new group of historians came along, the Post-Revisionists.
Okay, Post-Revisionists. What's their take?
Well, they said, let's just pump the brakes on this whole blame game a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, it does seem kind of like we're saying it was just like, some fender bender. One driver's fault, end of story.
Right, exactly. And the Cold War, I mean, come on, it was way more complicated than that.
Understatement of the century.
Like a massive pileup on the historical highway, right?
Yeah.
So these post-revisionists, they emphasize that miscommunication and unintended consequences played a huge role in how the Cold War unfolded.
Okay, so less about, intentional malice or whatever, more about just, people being people.
Exactly.
Making mistakes, assuming the worst.
Exactly. It's like, imagine two people trying to have a conversation, but there's, layers of thick glass between them. They can't quite hear each other properly. They're misinterpreting each other's words, their body language. They start reacting defensively.
And before you know it.
Things escalate.
Exactly.
And they don't even really mean to.
And then you've got a Cold War on your hands.
Right. So John Lewis Gaddis.
Okay, yeah.
A big name in Cold War history.
Big time.
He was one of the people really pushing this idea. He said that pinning the blame on one side or the other, it's way too simplistic.
Right.
He said the Cold War, it came about from this complicated interaction of external and internal developments inside both the United States and the Soviet Union.
Okay, so he's saying that both sides, they were misreading the signals, overreacting, assuming the worst about each other.
And it all just spiraled out of control from there.
It really makes you think, though, what if they'd just, gotten on the phone with each other a couple more times?
Right, or had like a group chat going.
Seriously.
But in all seriousness, let's look at an example here. We've talked about the Berlin Blockade, right?
Yeah.
The Orthodox historians, they see it as this blatant act of Soviet aggression. But the post-revisionists, they point out that, hey, from Stalin's perspective, he's reacting to a whole bunch of Western moves that seem pretty threatening to him.
Okay, I see what you're saying.
Like the Western powers had decided to merge their zones of occupation in Germany and introduce a new currency.
Which, yeah, to Stalin, that probably did look like a direct challenge.
Right. It looked like a power grab, a way to undermine Soviet influence in Eastern Europe. So what looks like aggression to the West, to Stalin, it's a defensive move, right? He's protecting his interests.
So it really is all about perspective.
Exactly. Another thing the post-revisionists point to are the what they call salami tactics that Stalin used in Eastern Europe.
Salami tactics. Okay, what's that all about?
So imagine a salami, right? You don't eat the whole thing in one bite. You slice it off bit by bit.
Right.
That's what Stalin did in Eastern Europe. He'd slowly chip away at democratic institutions, install these puppet governments loyal to Moscow, one slice at a time.
So to the West, it looks like this calculated takeover, this master plan for communist domination. Right.
But to Stalin, it was just Tuesday.
Well, maybe not just Tuesday. But you see the point. For Stalin, these salami tactics, they weren't about world domination. They were about security, creating a buffer zone between the USSR and the West. Don't forget, Russia, they've been invaded twice through Eastern Europe in the last 50 years, right?
Right.
So Stalin, he's deeply paranoid. And not without reason. He doesn't trust the West. And these small incremental moves, this is his way of ensuring that Soviet interests are protected.
Interesting. Okay, so we've got both sides acting out of this place of fear and suspicion, making these moves and counter moves.
Yeah.
And it all just spirals into this huge global standoff.
It's almost like Shakespearean, you know. but with nukes.
Oh, absolutely. Okay. So for a while there, it seemed like maybe the Cold War, it really was just this, tragic accident, a product of miscommunication and bad assumptions.
Right. Seems like a tidy explanation, doesn't it?
Kind of, yeah. Except then.
Except then the Berlin Wall falls.
Soviet Union collapses. The Iron Curtain comes crashing down.
And historians suddenly have access to all these documents that before they could only dream about.
The Soviet archive.
The Soviet archives. Talk about a plot twist. So what did those archives actually tell us? Were we right all along? Was it all just a big misunderstanding?
Well, not so fast. Those archives, they definitely answered some questions, but they also opened up a whole new can of worms.
Okay, I'm intrigued. And John Lewis Gaddis. You know, Mr. It's Complicated himself. What did he have to say about all this?
Even he had to admit, the archives painted a much more, shall we say, disturbing picture than a lot of people were expecting.
Okay, so what changed his mind?
These documents, especially the ones that show Stalin's personal directives, his inner thoughts, they led Gaddis to completely rethink his stance on the Cold War. He went from "it's complicated to as long as Stalin was running the Soviet Union, a Cold War was unavoidable.
Wow. So after decades of debate, are we basically back to square one, blaming Stalin? What was in those archives that made Gaddis and all these other historians have this major rethink?
Well, the archives, they showed a level of, ruthlessness and cold calculation. It was honestly chilling. They showed that for Stalin, this whole ideology thing, it was often just a tool.
The tool for what?
Power.
Power.
Power was the name of the game. Personal power, paranoia. Those were his real motivators.
Yeah.
And nothing illustrates this better than what happened during the Warsaw Uprising in 1944.
Okay, the Warsaw Uprising. I have to admit, I'm drawing a blank here.
So in 1944, the Polish resistance, incredibly brave people, by the way, they'd been fighting the Nazis for years, and they saw their chance. The Soviet army was approaching Warsaw. So the resistance, they decided to launch an uprising against the Nazis who were occupying the city. Their goal was to liberate Warsaw before the Soviets got there so they could install their own government.
Makes sense. You know, strike while the iron's hot. So what happened?
Here's the thing, Stalin. He had other plans for Poland.
Uh-oh.
He wanted a communist government there, one that was fully under his control. And the Polish resistance, well, they were mostly non-communist. He saw them as a potential problem.
So what did he do?
He let the Nazis crush the uprising.
He
let it happen.
let it happen. His army, they were right across the river. They could literally hear the fighting. But Stalin, he ordered them to just stay put.
Oh, my God.
The Nazis, they brutally crushed the uprising. Tens of thousands of Poles were killed, and Warsaw was practically leveled.
And Stalin just let it happen.
He let it happen. He was perfectly content to let the Nazis do his dirty work for him.
That's cold, even for Stalin.
Right. And this event, the Warsaw Uprising, it really made historians like Gaddis rethink Stalin's whole deal. See, the Warsaw Uprising, it wasn't about ideology for Stalin. It wasn't about securing a buffer zone or any of that. It was about eliminating evils, even if it meant sacrificing thousands of lives.
Gaddis wrote this, and I quote, "Stalin was as much a product of the Russian Civil War as of the Bolshevik Revolution. This was a man for whom the lesson of that earlier conflict had been the need for unremitting vigilance against enemies, foreign and domestic, whose liquidation was preferable to their conversion."
Okay, so to sum up, Stalin was ruthless.
And ambitious. Power-hungry, even.
Yeah. So where does that leave us? We've gone from blaming the Soviets to blaming the U.S. to wondering if it was all just a big misunderstanding, and now we're left with Stalin. This, ruthless, calculating figure who saw the world as his own personal chessboard.
And we were all just pawns in his game.
It's true. It's not like we can just hop in a time machine and get inside Stalin's head. All we have are these different interpretations, these different ways of looking at the Cold War.
And each of those interpretations, they came about at a specific moment in time, right? The Orthodox view, with its focus on Soviet ideology, that made a lot of sense in the 1950s with the Red Scare and all that. But then you have the Vietnam War. And all of a sudden, the revisionist interpretation, the one that emphasizes U.S. economic interests, that it starts to resonate with a lot of people.
So it's like, it's not just about what happened, it's also about how we make sense of it, right? Like, our understanding of the past, it's always evolving, changing along with the times.
Absolutely.
It makes you wonder, what will historians be saying about the Cold War 50 years from now?
Right. Will we look back on all of this and say, wow, we were so wrong?
Totally. But that's history for you, right? It's like this never-ending detective story.
Always searching for clues, trying to piece together the past.
Exactly. And as we've seen, sometimes the most important thing isn't finding all the answers.
It's about asking the right questions.
Okay, so let's do a quick recap here. We've got 4 main ways of looking at the Cold War. The Orthodox view blaming Soviet ideology, the revisionists pointing the finger at U.S. economic interests, the post-revisionists highlighting miscommunication and those unintended consequences, and then finally the perspective that emerges after the fall of the Soviet Union, the one that really puts Stalin's personality, his drive for power, front and center. It's a lot to take in.
It really is. But I think if we take away one thing from all of this, it's that trying to boil the Cold War down to a simple blame game, it just doesn't do it justice. This was a hugely complex conflict with all these different factors at play. And each of these perspectives, they offer valuable insights into how it all unfolded.
So where does that leave us? What are we supposed to think after all of this?
That's the beauty of it, right? You get to decide. Nobody can tell you there's one right answer when it comes to history. I think the real value in looking at these different perspectives is that it helps us understand how something as massive and complex as the Cold War could even happen. It reminds us that even these huge world-changing events, they're still driven by human choices, human flaws, and sometimes, let's face it, just plain bad luck.
I like that. It's not about finding the bad guy. It's about trying to understand the bigger picture.
Exactly.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the Cold War, I'm curious, what about you, our listeners? What stood out to you? Which of these perspectives did you find the most persuasive? And maybe even, what events that are happening today, things in the news right now, might historians in the future look back on and reinterpret? Just something to think about. Until next time, keep diving deep and never stop questioning.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.